As well as using images and diagrams from others, you'll also need to create your own. You'll almost certainly need to do this as part of creating your own thesis or research. Diagrams, however, do not need to be complicated. They can be as simple as linked boxes with arrows. Here you can see an example on my slide. These are very easy to create in either Microsoft Word or PowerPoint. There's also a whole range of different symbols and shapes that can help you do this, and diagrams can be animated meaningfully to help you when you're creating conference presentations. This is a useful way to break information down and to present it when required. Let's have a look in PowerPoint to see how we could create a simple diagram. In PowerPoint, if you head to the Insert ribbon, you'll see a whole different range of drawing tools are available. The simplest place to start is with shapes. Here you'll see a whole range of different arrows, flowchart shapes, callouts, and regular shapes. Double clicking on these will let you add text. You can continue to go to Insert and shape more and insert more shapes as required. These can be copied and pasted to save you time. And you can recolour them as required for your particular project. They're very easy to link as well. If I go back to Insert and then Shapes, I can use this arrow tool. As soon as I hover over any shape, these little dots appear. I can click on one of those and draw from and to another shape. These are now linked, and the arrow will move as I rearrange my diagram. This is just one example of how you can start to form some of your own drawings. Word also has SmartArt graphics, available in PowerPoint too. These are pre-designed, quick, and very easy to use. They can be used to show different presentation structures, or method processes, hierarchies, and flowcharts. It's really simple to use any of these. Let's head back to PowerPoint and look. On both the Insert ribbon of Word and PowerPoint, you'll see under Illustrations there is a SmartArt option. In here you can preview the range of designs, lists, processes, cycles, hierarchies, relationships, matrices, pyramids, pictures, and further ones available online are all there for use. To use any of these, all you need to do is find one that's similar to your requirements, then simply double click on it. You can then begin to use the pane on the left hand side to write out your text. This is just a quick demonstration, but it shows you how easy these SmartArt objects are to design. They'll resize automatically as you move them, and they maintain editability, letting you select different colours and styles. This is something that may work in a journal. However, for a presentation we can go for something that's more colourful and stand out. We just need to make sure that whichever colours we use have sufficient contrast for when this is published. These are also fully accessible, so they're great to make your diagrams and designs inclusive. Diagrams like this are really useful to help you simplify text. Here you can see an example from my own thesis. I've taken a synthesis of the etymology of the word library, and instead presented it as a diagram. Here you can see a direct comparison between the dictionary and the way I've presented it here. I hope you'll agree that my diagram is much easier to see the evolution of this word. There's also a specialist drawing program available called Visio. This is installed on all University of Hull computers, and you'll find it in the library and our postgraduate research space. This is really useful for you to help you create similar diagrams. It's got very similar tools to Word and PowerPoint, allowing you to draw shapes and link them together. However, Visio is useful for much more complicated diagrams with multiple steps and complex interactions. Here you can see an example abstract of a diagram that I produced for a book recently published. This shows the workflow for coding in NVivo, something that's very complicated to describe with words but very easy to visualise. Here we can see how the processes follow one on through another, and how some of those processes might trigger you to go back and visit your data again. Now, these could be created in Word or PowerPoint, but the automated tools in Visio are more flexible, so if you have access to one of the University of Hull machines, I'd recommend giving it a go. If you don't have access to Visio, don't worry. Word and PowerPoint are both extremely powerful and adaptive drawing tools. Here is an example of something completely drawn in PowerPoint. You can get very creative with this. Here is an example of a graph that has been drawn completely using Microsoft PowerPoint shapes and symbols. While these can take a little time to form, they are very powerful images to help you illustrate points in your slides. In PowerPoint, you also have the ability to animate your drawings too. Animation should be done sparingly and only where it can be used to indicate meaning. These examples here do show you, however, that you can do some quite complicated 3-dimensional and 2-dimensional annotations and animations to illustrate your points. For a lot of research, you'll also be using specialist software that may produce diagrams and visualizations for you. The two sampled here are extracts from NVivo queries. However, you do often need to work and spend a fair bit of time when creating your diagrams to make sure they're appropriate. Here you can see some default export on the left hand side compared to one on the right hand side that's been ordered, hierarchied, linked and annotated to make it a much more meaningful diagram. The same goes for graphs. Quite often you'll get simple outputs, but some very simple adjustments in the program let us remove unneeded variables, add titles and axes labels that really improve the diagram. Likewise, here we have a tree map, another example of a diagram that shows the quantity of which a word is used. However, with a little bit of thought and time, we can instead visualise this as a word cloud. Both of these diagrams plot the same information, but they do so in very different ways. Hopefully you'll agree that this one is a much more expressive, powerful and creative way of displaying this same information. You may find you need to create some very specific images for your discipline. Here we have the example of a map. Again, just like the graphs, these can be good or bad. Here we have a very basic map. This is just a screenshot from Google Maps. It's quite busy and it's very difficult to see any information in here. Clearly, to use this we need to make it much more meaningful. So switching to the map view instead of the aerial photography in this case does make it much easier to read. We can see different roads and places much more clearly. However, if we want to take this a step above, I'd be much better accessing geospatial information to produce a proper map. Here I get much more control over what I can do, and in specialist software I'm able to properly select the extract that I want and even annotate my map to make it much easier for people to use. You'll also see the information available has varied from very little at all to including scale bars and north arrows and later annotations. These are all ways in which we can make maps much more meaningful. You need to reflect on what specialist diagrams you will be producing in your discipline and how to do them in a way that produces them so they are highly usable and quality. More commonly, you'll come across charts which are used to visualise numerical data. Here you'll see an example of a chart that has been specially created for a presentation. While this might not look appropriate in a report or a journal article, this is actually a very visual and effective chart for presentations. Here you can see we have a very clear point. Only 5% of communication is words. To really accentuate this point, we've used a pie chart and pulled the relevant segment out. We've used the red colour for the text, for the legend, and for that particular segment to really highlight our point. To background, tone and body language, we've indicated them in a grey colour. They're still visible, but here it really draws a clear connection with colour to the point we're trying to make. Words in communication are actually a very small part. However, just like with the maps, there can be good and bad charts. Here we have a chart that was produced in Excel, just using one of the default templates. While this kind of looks effective, it's actually missing some really vital work to help a reader see which axes different data series belong to. There's no title, so we have no idea what this information is actually about, and there's a whole range of different things that are quite tricky to understand. We can immediately improve this by just applying one of the default templates in Excel. It's added axes labels and a title, and it's much clearer now. However, like many of these templates, they're also quite busy. We've got some unneeded shading in the background, and this can actually just complicate the diagram further than is needed. So to enhance this, we can remove that shading and start to do a few tweaks. We've made the title bigger and bolder to make it stand out. And finally, the legend at the bottom makes it very clear which data series links to which axes. Now, while that might be appropriate for a print report, if we're producing this for a slide, we'd want to visualise this in a simpler way. Here, I've made use of colour to really accentuate which axes links to which data series. I've made the titles bigger and bolder, abbreviated the months and made the font bigger to really clarify this for projection. I've also removed the title and instead replaced it with a real key point that the graph is trying to demonstrate. There were over 98,000 visits to the Poppleton Library in 2018. So, the important take-home message from this is that what is an appropriate chart for a presentation is not necessarily an appropriate chart for print. Quite often when we're visualising information for different contexts, we need to tweak it appropriately. And here you can see I've managed to add an annotation that annotates in to really accentuate a point about one particular month. Just like charts, even tables can also be good or bad. Here we have a terrible table. We can see some of the columns are not wide enough, with September, November and December dropping some letters down to a second line. The alignment on unique students and visits is actually very difficult to line up to the columns, and it's really easy to read the wrong row. If we look at June and read across, it's actually really difficult to see which line lines up. We can immediately make this table better by just throwing in some borders and making the columns wide enough so that the data fits in. However, we can make this even easier to read with a little bit of shading and proper alignment. This is just one of the default table templates in Word, As soon as I've applied this, it's immediately better, and it took seconds. Anytime you use a figure, it should be labelled, and the convention for a table is that your label should go above, whereas for a figure, it should be below. Quite often, it's standard practice for you to label these in numerical order, and also including the chapter number. So in this example here, table 2.1 would be the first table in chapter 2, and figure 4.1 would be the first figure in chapter 4. Tables and figures have their own independent numbering schemes, so we would have table 123 and figure 123. For your next activity, we'd like you to try and create a diagram that represents your research structure, and we're hoping to see some of you share it in this week's webinar. You don't have to make this diagram too complicated. It could be an indication of what chapter your thesis is going to have, or if you're earlier in the research process, it might outline what your data collection is going to look like. Use this as an opportunity to create a meaningful diagram that you'll be able to use in your thesis or a presentation, and we look forward to seeing you in the webinar.